Hi, I'm Ken Howard, and welcome to the Gay Therapy LA podcast. Today, I want to talk about gay men and reconciling your religious beliefs with your sexuality. So in my experience as a gay men specialist therapist for 30 years in 2022 in California, and life, career, relationship coach nationally and worldwide, I've written before and talked about gay men reclaiming their spirituality. That's on my blog. If you go to gaytherapyla.com/blog and just search in the search box for spirituality, it'll come up. And I forget if we have a podcast episode on that, but search on spirituality. So that was one kind of initial angle on that, about gay men having the right to reclaim their spirituality. But I wanted to talk about this today because someone messaged me recently on Instagram and asked me to address the topic of reconciling your religious beliefs with your sexuality as a gay man. And there are many aspects to this, so I'd just like to offer you my perspective. So clinical social workers like me are taught to assess each new client that they work with at the start of the work in what's called a bio for biological, psycho for psychological, and social. So the biopsychosocial assessment, and I used to teach this at USC's graduate social work program. This kind of information talks about, who they are, the challenges they'd like some help with, from mild life stressors all the way up to coping with major psychiatric disorders and trauma. And part of understanding someone is about their name, their age, their ethnicity, their location, their health status, stuff historically about their family of origin, their mental status, their socioeconomic status, or any money or financial pressures or hardships, disabilities of any kind, strictly physical or psychiatric, their strengths also, to work from a strengths perspective, the types of relationships they have, their interpersonal relationship status with partners, but it could also be friends and coworkers and bosses and subordinates and all of that. So the better social workers or therapists will address the person's spirituality, whether it is one of the many world religions, or is a person is a secular humanist or an agnostic or an atheist. The better therapist will also talk about sexual history, but woefully this is ignored and overlooked by many therapists who either can't or don't want to explore this. It's a big problem in psychotherapy nationwide because therapists actually get much less training in sexuality unless you have specific continuing education in it, as I have. But it's a problem when therapists and clients avoid the issues entirely. People expect their therapist to be well versed in sexuality, and most of them aren't. So nearly all the time, I work with gay men who want nothing to do with organized religion, as most have in some way been abused by religious institutions, telling them their whole lives that they are sick and bad and wrong just for being gay. Or saying, well, it's okay to be gay, but just don't act on it. That's crap. Understandably, this causes a lot of ire and frustration, as it's a profound, existential level devaluing of who that gay man is. You can't separate being gay from the person, just like you can't separate somebody's height from who they are. It's part of the package deal of who that person is demographically. So as we grow up and go from little gay boys to adult gay men, each of us, has to somehow come to terms with what kind of spirituality we grew up with our parents or other child-rearing figures. It's not always parents. And many influences. So let's look at some of those influences and how we all got here in terms of what influenced us and what to do about it. So number one is our place of birth and our national local culture. I work with mostly gay men in Los Angeles or West Hollywood, California, but this often means working with guys who were born and grew up in other places. LA is full of people from other parts of the country or the world. With my remote sessions in coaching, I work with guys all over the world as well through webcam coaching. So when we're trying to make sense of the often confusing influences that we grew up with in our spirituality, we need to consider our place of birth, our place of upbringing, which is not always the same place, and the cultural context. That's big with social workers, working with what's called the person in environment theory and understanding that person's functioning, psychological functioning, in a cultural context. What were the influences of our national origin or even our local culture? So a gay man growing up in rural East Texas might have a very different experience from a guy who grew up in New York City. And even two gay men who grew up, and went to the exact same schools can have very different subjective experiences. In the United States, the Anglo background Southern guys are often influenced by Southern Baptist or evangelical dogma. And these religions are officially and especially virulently anti-gay, and this would be true of conservative Islam across the world as well. And this pressure on gay boys who grow up hearing, as I did, specifically anti-gay male, actually, less so with lesbians, dogma can easily experience this as a repeated trauma. So I remember growing up outside of Washington, D.C. in Northern Virginia, and my parents dragging me to a Southern Baptist church. So for some perspective here, this church was also attended by the notorious Senator Strom Thurmond of South Carolina, who was very old by then, but he was a virulent racist and an avowed segregationist in history and fought the civil rights movement with everything he had. And I remember the smooth-talking Southern preacher with his white leather shoes railing from the pulpit about the homosexual. And while I really didn't know what that was, at the age of 10, I always got an uneasy feeling in my stomach when he did this. Somehow I knew he was talking about me. And I still wonder to this day if I actually blushed sitting in the pew. So I'm now in my 50s, and I remember this experience from the 1970s. See, this is what I mean when I say that experiences in anti-gay churches can have a lasting and negative impact on the self-esteem and self-concept of gay men. And I hear similar experiences from many or even most of my gay male clients. And much of this has to do with history, immigration, migration that goes back in your family tree to wherever your ancestors settled. To understand the influences on you and what can create inner conflicts about how you were raised and how you feel, you have to understand all that 23andMe or Ancestry.com stuff about our ancestors and how their natural cultural traditions influence us, probably more than we actually realize. So number 2 is the influence of family of origin and childhood. Beyond the broader local culture of various religions, or even a dominant one in your area, such as the Catholic influence in the American Midwest, often from German immigrants by history, or Catholic Latinos in the Southwest, we grow up in a culture of our family of origin. Your family might have been Baptist, but the family next door might have been Catholic or Jewish. Even your own individual family's interpretation of religion can vary, and sometimes even within the same family. My mother was raised Southern Baptist, but my father was raised Presbyterian. And so even my mom's parents, who were Southern Baptists, were somewhat anti-gay light, but their especially loving nature, they were some of my favorite people in my life so far, prevented the virulent antipathy we see so much of now in politics. There was less political involvement of Baptists when I was young, 60s and 70s. My maternal grandmother, for instance, was a first grade teacher for 30 years in Southern Virginia and vehemently opposed homeschooling. She thought that was baloney. That was the modern Baptist or evangelical thing about, I don't want my kids exposed to all these perverts. And they would keep them home, to indoctrinate them with an anti-gay dogma and keep them out of the public schools. This still goes on. And she opposed homeschooling because she said, in this world, people need to learn, young, as kids, how to get along with all different kinds of people. My father's father was technically Presbyterian, but he was raised in the early 20th century by remarkably modern and liberal parents, such as calling his parents by their first names in the 1910s, and describing his spirituality as a somewhat vague collection of beliefs influenced by his mother's devout interest in numerology and parts of the occult and other late 19th, early 20th century traditions, which was odd for me to learn as a child that the early 20th century had been more progressive in some ways in many areas, urban places like Boston or New York, than the mid-20th century during the height of the Cold War, when under God was added to the Pledge of Allegiance by Congress because they deliberately wanted to stick it to those godless Russians. So those are just my examples, but think about your own family. Where were the consistent messages of what you were taught? And where were the inconsistencies or the variations? In this way, you observe different people holding somewhat individualized perspectives. And you get to have your own individualized perspective of what works for you. There is no one right way, even in conservatively religious families. Number 3 is the adult identity of your spirituality and your sexuality. So this brings us to the opportunity, or even the challenge, to craft your own spiritual identity as an empowered adult. You get to bring the critical thinking that comes with growing up to what you were taught as a child versus what you believe now. If you were taught that sex before marriage, even heterosexually, was forbidden, you don't have to believe that now. If you were taught gay men are all going to hell, you don't have to believe that now. For generations in your family and in everyone's, really, there have been even subtle variations on beliefs based on the individual who is believing them. Many gay men talk with me about the conflicts they can have between their spirituality or religion, including what they were taught originally versus what they feel and believe now, and contrast that with what they were taught, if anything, about sexuality. And then there is how they feel about both. What feels comfortable for you? What kind of spirituality do you want to make your own? And what kind of sexuality or sexual identity? We talk about sexual orientation fluidity. We talk about being a top versus a bottom. We talk about vanilla versus kink play. We talk about dyads, relationship with one person versus polycules and polyamory. And so all of these things are about where do you fall on the variations of the spirituality or the sexuality that a person can be, that even a gay man can be. So very few gay men get affirmative messages about being gay when they are children or adolescents, or even the possibility that this might be so. There just isn't much affirmation of that. There's a presumption of heterosexuality that we have to correct everyone on when we come out. And we have to sort of unlearn the negative messages, either the absence of affirmations for being gay or even the presence of very specifically negative anti-gay messages. And we unlearn these things once we grow up, when we're consenting adults, when there might be a lot of critical thinking about what beliefs and even actions gay men want to keep as their parents or their family of origin taught them, and what they want to discard. It's like cleaning out your closet. I want to keep this, I want to throw away this. This is part of both the opportunity and the obligation of being an adult. Sex, political affiliation, religion, money management, vocation, hobbies, values, positions on social issues. All of these are variables to be sorted out in terms of coming to terms with who we are. It's part of becoming a young adult. We're not a kid anymore. We have adult positions, even if maybe our positions change on some things. The key here is having and thinking that part of the adult prerogative is forming these values and priorities and beliefs for yourself, and they really aren't anyone else's business. It's affirming that. That's true for men and women, straight and gay, that when you grow up, you really affirm who you are and what works for you, even if other people might be very different from you. Number 4 is reconciling the conflicts in and around you. So it could easily be that you want to keep some of the more positive aspects of religion or spirituality that you were raised with, like kindness, compassion, your relationship with humanity and nature, even how you treat animals. You might want to continue to observe the religious holidays and traditions and rituals that you grew up with, because you associate them with positive feelings and ideas, like being close to your family, having fun with the traditions, having an appreciation for rituals and holidays and traditions and their meaning in helping us to understand the nature of the world. But you also have to declare yourself empowered to make interpretations and value judgments for yourself, and what is compelling and what works for you. If you like the positive aspects of whatever religion or spiritual tradition you were raised with, well, then keep them. But if there are negative aspects that involve anti-LGBT antipathy, or sexism, or racism, or anything you don't like, the empowered adult in you has the right to discard those aspects and reject that kind of negative thinking entirely. Not only do you have the right to do this for yourself, but you really have the obligation. That's part of stepping up and sucking it up and being an adult. This is what makes you an informed, aware, autonomous adult, and not just some indoctrinated sheep that simply does what he's told without question. Some guys think they can't do this because they can't just pick and choose from dogma or scripture from sacred texts. But when you think about it, we all do this, not just gay men. Even your devout mother or devout father or other primary caretaker of you as a child would be doing at least some interpretation of broader group spiritual traditions and beliefs as they either understand them to various degrees or want to practice them. It's not like you're the only one sorting things out and finding what works for you. What is affirmative to you of who you are and what has meaning for you, what is a comfort or a solace for you, and what makes sense to you. But everyone's doing this in some way. And this can be any, some, of all, or no spiritual structure to follow. Secular humanists, who are, okay, my favorite, can be this way, where we believe we are all equal, and no one spiritual tradition or practice or nationality is inherently superior to anyone else in all the world and in all history when it comes to explaining nature and the nature of humankind and the cosmos. And yes, we can hold traditions accountable. When I hold conservative evangelicalism or Catholicism or Protestantism or Islam or Judaism or whatever, when I hold them accountable for their negative influences on people in the world that lead to wars and bombings and beatings and maiming and murder, or even just discrimination, workplace discrimination, academic discrimination, whatever, that is an empowered action. I frankly enjoy fighting back against religious oppression, not only of what I am as a gay man, but also others I care about, such as women who are being oppressed, with the current horrible oppression of women in the new Afghanistan radical, extreme conservative Taliban adulteration of Islam that requires women to be covered except for their eyes in public, or the greedy extortion of Hollywood professionals by the so-called Church of Scientology. Now, I'm not a woman and I'm not a Hollywood professional, but I stick up for them against religious oppression anyway. That's in my value system. I care about things that don't necessarily affect me directly. The positive spiritualities of world religions I respect, such as charity, compassion, and emotional support, are great. The negative aspects, when it's used for oppression of either humans or animals, I'm going to speak up. We can all do that. We can fight back against the oppressions that we either experience ourselves or experience vicariously by observation of the oppression of people we care about. Or even ones we don't especially know or identify with, but we care about them anyway. It's called human decency, which may or may not be associated with a world religious tradition. Number 5 is our future self-concept, what and why. Once we use this critical thinking to understand who we are versus what we might have been encouraged or demanded to be spiritually in our family of origin, we move forward on the path of life as proud, healthy people, free of the burdens of having to hate the people our relatives taught us to hate, as Oscar Hammerstein II wrote in the classic song from their Broadway musical South Pacific, which was about an interracial romance. It was called You Have to Be Carefully Taught, a song that Richard Rodgers and Oscar Hammerstein really stood by because they had very progressive values for the most part. Richard Rodgers was known to be a little homophobic, but worked with Lorenz Hart, who was a gay lyricist for him early on. And You Have to Be Carefully Taught was a song that they insisted on and stood behind because they tried to ban that song or even whole productions of South Pacific in the American South back in the late 40s or early 50s. So there are many or most gay men that believe that God or Goddess or the gods or nature gave us a human sexuality for a reason. We don't procreate that way, but we serve a purpose about human relationships and interaction. There are people who say that gay men are useless to society because they don't procreate. Well, lots of people don't procreate, either for physical problems or they just choose not to. It's a very demanding, harsh political stance that says that we must be heterosexual and that we must procreate so that we create little workers for the oligarchy. But we exalt ourselves and each other when we celebrate and practice our sexuality as a gift and part of the nature of being alive, like food and drink and sleep and peeing and pooping and all those things about what it means to be the human animal. Many believe we wouldn't want sexual expression if we somehow were not supposed to have it, to be sexually active in whatever ways work for you, and have a physical and emotional and interpersonal and even community meaning for you. Being spiritual and being gay are not actually incompatible, because that's just one more variation on our understanding and interpretation and belief system that we hold, as everyone does. Being compassionate to ourselves as gay men means that although we might have been oppressed by some kind of antipathy from whatever anti-LGBT religious exposure we've had in the past, that's not something we need to carry on in our sense of self forever, like a backpack full of rocks. We can set the backpack full of rocks down, that burden, gently, or we could toss it with great force and continue on our merry way on the path of life. That said, enjoy the trip. If you'd like more information on my psychotherapy services in California or my coaching services for everywhere else, or sex therapy and sex education support, would be happy to help. Just call me or probably text me at 310-339-5778. That's 310-339-5778. Or email ken@gaytherapyla.com for more information and all the details. Try to share this podcast with others. I get some very nice emails. I got one recently on Instagram also about suggestions for podcast episode topics, including this one. So you know who you are out there. Thank you for the ideas. And if others of you have ideas for new episodes of what you want to hear more about from me, please let me know. And I'd be happy to try and put them in the queue for future episodes. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you next time.